A mailbox started it all, but it ended with the HOA rewriting every rule. It all began with something so small, it felt almost laughable. A simple letter tucked into my mailbox carried a message that would spark a battle I never imagined. The HOA claimed that my mailbox, a perfectly functional, modest, and well-kept structure, did not meet their aesthetic standards. According to them, the color, the post, and even the small decorative numbers on the side violated their community guidelines. At first, I thought it was a mistake. My mailbox had been there since the house was built, long before I moved in. It wasn't falling apart, it wasn't an eyesore, and it certainly wasn't against any written rule I had ever seen. Still, the HOA insisted I replace it with one of their approved designs at my own expense. I tried to shrug it off, but then came the fines. Every week, a new notice showed up in that very same non-compliant mailbox, demanding payment for rules that weren't even in the handbook. What started as an annoying letter quickly snowballed into a campaign of intimidation. I didn't realize it then, but my fight over this mailbox was about to expose the HOA's biggest secret. The fines kept stacking up, and I knew something wasn't right. So I went digging. I pulled out every version of the HOA handbook I could find, even the archived copies neighbors had stashed away. Page after page, I combed through the rules, looking for the supposed mailbox regulation that justified the HOA's demands. It wasn't there, not in the old rules, not in the new ones, not in any amendment. The only references to mailboxes were about keeping them upright and free of damage. Mine met those standards perfectly. That's when I realized this wasn't about the mailbox, it was about control. The HOA board, led by a president with a reputation for bullying homeowners, had been quietly inventing rules to target anyone who didn't fall in line, and I wasn't their first victim. I started talking to neighbors, and the stories poured in. A woman fined for having the wrong shade of mulch, a man threatened over his garden hose being visible, another family charged for holiday lights they took down weeks before the deadline. My mailbox was just the latest excuse. What the HOA didn't expect was that I wasn't about to roll over. This mailbox fight was becoming a community rebellion. With proof in hand and neighbors backing me, I decided it was time to confront the HOA head-on. The next board meeting was packed tighter than usual. Word had spread fast about the mailbox war. People came out of curiosity, frustration, and maybe a bit of hope that someone would finally stand up to the board. When my turn came to speak, I laid everything out. I presented the handbook copies, highlighted the sections, and showed where the so-called mailbox regulation didn't exist. I read aloud the inconsistencies in their fines and displayed letters I'd collected from other residents who had also been wrongfully targeted. The room buzzed with murmurs. The president tried to dismiss me, waving it off as a misunderstanding, but the crowd wasn't buying it. For once, the spotlight wasn't on me, it was on them. The board members shifted uncomfortably as neighbors began asking their own questions, louder and more direct than before. That night, the meeting ended in chaos, but something important had changed. The HOA wasn't the untouchable authority it pretended to be anymore. Cracks were forming in their wall of power, and I was determined to push until it all collapsed. The aftermath of that meeting sparked something I hadn't seen in years: unity among the residents. For too long, the HOA had thrived on keeping people quiet and divided, but now everyone had a common cause. My mailbox had become the symbol of resistance, and neighbors who had once stayed silent started stepping forward with their own stories. People shared how they were fined for flowers that were too bright, fences that were too tall, or even for leaving holiday lights up one day too long. The more they spoke, the clearer it became. The board had been bending non-existent rules to control the neighborhood and pad their fines. Within a week, we organized an informal gathering at my house. Over coffee and folding chairs, we drafted a petition demanding transparency, a review of the bylaws, and a halt to all unfair fines. Signatures poured in faster than I imagined, even from residents who had never dared to challenge the board before. The HOA president caught wind of it quickly. Within days, I received another threatening letter, this time warning of legal consequences if I didn't back down. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't standing alone anymore. The HOA board called for an emergency meeting, and this time the atmosphere was electric. Residents filled the room, clutching copies of the petition and their own violation letters. For once, the board wasn't in control of the narrative, the community was. The president opened with his usual authoritative tone, accusing me of spreading misinformation and inciting unrest. But when he tried to dismiss the petition, dozens of neighbors raised their hands in protest. Voices rose, demanding accountability, transparency, and proof of the rules they claimed to enforce. One neighbor stood and produced copies of the original HOA bylaws, showing everyone that half the fines issued over the past year weren't even supported by written rules. Gasps filled the room, and the president's face turned pale as the board's tactics were laid bare for all to see. The president tried to adjourn the meeting early, but the crowd refused to leave. What started as a fight over my mailbox had now transformed into a full-scale revolt. The weeks following the explosive meeting brought sweeping changes. Under immense pressure, the HOA board was forced to convene again, this time with attorneys and a neutral mediator present. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Illegal fines, fabricated rules, and years of unchecked power. They had no choice but to back down. The mailbox violation that had sparked the feud was officially dismissed, and with it, dozens of other bogus citations were canceled for residents across the neighborhood. The petition gained so much traction that the HOA was compelled to rewrite its entire rulebook, stripping away vague or overreaching clauses. For the first time, the community had rules that were clear, fair, and transparent. The president resigned quietly, hoping to avoid further scrutiny, while several other board members chose not to run for re-election. In their place, new voices from the community, people who valued fairness over control, stepped in. As for me, my non-compliant mailbox still stood proudly at the end of my driveway, a quiet reminder of how one small stand could spark a revolution. What began as their attempt to control me had instead reshaped the entire neighborhood. And from that day forward, the HOA learned a lesson they'd never forget. When you push too far, even a mailbox can become the symbol of a movement.